tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Quiet Life. Jack Hudson stood in the doorway of his workshop, watching his 8-year-old daughter Emma chase fireflies in the fading Texas twilight. The sprawling ranch house behind him seemed peaceful enough. White picket fence, manicured lawn, the American dream wrapped in mortgage payments and Sunday barbecues. But Jack knew better than most that appearances could be deceiving. At 42, Jack had built what most would call a successful life. Owner of Hudson Security Consulting, he provided personal protection and security systems for wealthy clients across the Southwest. His neighbors saw him as the quiet, dependable type, a former Army veteran who'd settled into suburban tranquility with his wife Darla and their daughter. They had no idea that Jack's military service had been far from conventional, or that his consulting work involved skills most civilians couldn't fathom. "Daddy, look," Emma called out, cupping her small hands around a captured firefly. "I got one." Jack smiled, the kind of genuine expression that had become rarer over the past year. "Let go, sweetheart. They're prettier when they're free." Emma released the firefly and watched it dance away into the darkness. It was a simple moment, but Jack filed away like he did all precious things, carefully, knowing how quickly they could be lost. Inside the house, Darla Hudson moved through their kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing dinner with the kind of mechanical precision that spoke of routine rather than passion. At 36, she remained beautiful in that carefully maintained way that required gym memberships and salon appointments. Her auburn hair fell in perfect waves, and her figure still turned heads at the country club. But Jack had noticed the subtle changes over the past 6 months. The way her phone was always face down on the counter. The mysterious girls' nights out that seemed to multiply. The carefully constructed explanations for her whereabouts that had too many details to be spontaneous. Jack Hudson was a man who made his living by noticing details others missed. In Fallujah, a misplaced shadow could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. In his current line of work, reading people was still a matter of survival, just with different stakes. "Dinner's ready," Darla called out, her voice carrying that slightly forced cheerfulness that had become her default tone around him. As they sat around the dinner table, Emma chattered about her day at school while Darla's attention drifted. Jack watched his wife check her phone twice during their daughter's story about the class hamster. The second time, he caught the ghost of a smile on her lips before she quickly composed herself. "So, Jack," Darla said, cutting in her chicken with surgical precision, "I was thinking of taking Emma to visit Dad next weekend. You know how he's been asking to see more of her." Howard Carpenter, Darla's father, owned a sprawling ranch about 3 hours north. The old man had never particularly liked Jack, though he'd been civil enough during the courtship and early marriage. Howard was old-school Texas, born on the land, raised on the land, and suspicious of anyone who hadn't been. "That sounds fine," Jack said evenly. "About a client consultation anyway." It was a lie, but a necessary one. Jack had learned to create space in his schedule for surveillance work when needed. And lately, he needed it more often. After dinner, as Darla helped Emma with her homework, Jack retreated to his study. The room looked like any successful businessman's office. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, walls lined with books and framed certificates. But behind the false wall concealed by a bookshelf, Jack maintained a different kind of office. High-grade surveillance equipment, tactical gear, and files on various subjects of interest. Tonight, he pulled out a manila folder labeled DH Surveillance, Phase 1. The photographs told a story that Darla thought she was keeping secret. Her lunch meetings with Brett Wolfe had started innocently enough. Chance encounters at the coffee shop, brief conversations in public places. But over the past 2 months, those meetings had moved to more private locations. Hotels, his apartment, long drives in his car. Brett Wolfe was a real estate developer, successful and charismatic in that aggressive way that appealed to some women. Divorced, no kids, and with a reputation around town for being a player. Jack had done his research on Brett the moment the first photograph showed something more than friendly conversation. What Darla didn't know was that Jack had been documenting everything from the beginning. Every meeting, every lie, every moment of what she thought was secret passion. He had audio recordings, GPS tracking data, and enough photographic evidence to end their marriage in any court in Texas. But Jack Hudson wasn't interested in a simple divorce. The phone buzzed on his desk. A text from his contact at the phone company, someone who owed him a favor from his consulting work. The message was brief, package delivered. All calls and texts now routing through your system. Jack smiled for the second time that day, though this expression would have been far less comforting to his daughter. Phase 2 could begin. As he locked the files away, Jack heard Darla putting Emma to bed upstairs. Their daughter's laughter echoed down the hallway, followed by Darla's softer voice reading a bedtime story. It was such a normal domestic sound, the kind of moment that made some men reconsider their plans. Jack Hudson was not some man. He'd learned long ago that betrayal came in many forms. Sometimes it was an enemy combatant pretending to be a friendly local. Sometimes it was a partner who sold you out for the right price. And sometimes it was the woman who'd sworn to love, honor, and cherish you, sharing your bed while planning a different future. The difference was that in his previous life, betrayal was expected, planned for, accepted as part of the operational environment. In civilian life, people called it marriage. They wrote vows about it, made promises about it, built entire lives on the assumption that it meant something. Jack had believed in those promises once. He'd trusted that the woman who'd said yes to his proposal, who'd cried happy tears at their wedding, who'd held his hand in the delivery room when Emma was born, meant what she'd said about forever. Now he knew better. As the house settled into quiet, Jack made his way upstairs. Darla was already in bed, seemingly asleep, though he noticed the way her breathing wasn't quite deep enough to be genuine. Her phone lay on a nightstand, charging and innocent-looking. What she didn't know was that every text, every call, every secret communication was now being copied to Jack's secure server. Tomorrow, he would begin to understand the full scope of her betrayal. And more importantly, he would begin to understand what Brett Wolfe meant to her. Because Jack Hudson had learned something important during his years in dark corners of the world. The best revenge wasn't just about punishment. It was about complete and total destruction of everything the target valued most. As he lay in the darkness next to his unfaithful wife, Jack began to plan. Chapter 2. Unraveling Threads. 3 weeks later, Jack sat in his truck outside Brett Wolfe's downtown office, watching through high-powered binoculars as his wife emerged from the building's parking garage. Even from a distance, he could see the flush in her cheeks, the slightly mussed hair she was attempting to smooth back into place. The surveillance equipment he'd installed in Brett's car and office had provided Jack with more than enough evidence of the affair. But evidence wasn't his goal anymore. Understanding was. Through the intercepted communications, Jack had learned that Darla and Brett weren't just having a physical affair. They were making plans. Real plans. Plans that involved Emma. The audio from yesterday's meeting still echoed in Jack's mind. Darla's voice, breathless and excited, talking about how they could be together if they handled the Jack situation properly. Brett's response had been equally telling. Casual mention of a private investigator he knew who could dig up dirt on Jack's consulting work, paint him as an unfit father. They weren't just betraying him. They were planning to take his daughter. Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he watched Darla drive away, probably heading home to prepare dinner and ask about his day with that same false smile she'd perfected. His phone buzzed. A text from Howard Carpenter, Darla's father. Need to talk. Come by the ranch tonight. Alone. Interesting. Jack had been monitoring Howard's communications too, as a matter of thoroughness. The old man had been having regular conversations with Brett Wolfe over the past month. Conversations that hadn't included Darla. Jack had initially assumed Howard was ignorant of his daughter's affair, but the intercepted calls suggested something far more complex. Howard Carpenter, it seemed, had his own agenda. That evening, Jack told Darla he had to meet a potential client out of town and might be late. She accepted the explanation with what seemed like genuine relief, probably eager for the free time to text with Brett without hiding her phone. The drive to Howard's ranch took Jack through increasingly remote countryside. The Carpenter family had owned this land for generations, and Howard had expanded it over the years into a sprawling operation that included cattle, oil leases, and enough acreage to get lost in. Jack found Howard on the wraparound porch of the main house, a glass of bourbon in his weathered hands. At 71, Howard Carpenter was still a formidable man, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that came from decades of commanding respect through force of will. "Jack," Howard nodded, gesturing to a second chair and a waiting glass. "Thanks for coming." "Howard." Jack accepted the drink, but didn't sit. "What's this about?" The older man studied him for a long moment. "You know, I never much liked you when Darla first brought you around. Too quiet, too careful. Seemed like the type who was always thinking 3 moves ahead. And now I'm thinking that might be exactly what this family needs." Howard reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, setting it on the table between them. "Open it." Inside were photographs. Brett Wolfe entering and leaving various locations around town. But these weren't Jack's surveillance photos. The angles and quality were different. Someone else had been watching Brett. "How long have you known?" Jack asked. "About Darla's affair?" "Since it started." "About Brett's real plans?" Howard's expression darkened. That took a little longer to figure out. Jack waited. Howard Carpenter wasn't the type to reveal information without a reason. "Brett Wolfe isn't just sleeping with my daughter," Howard continued. "He's been researching our family for months. Our holdings, our assets, our weaknesses. He's been using his real estate connections to quietly option land around my property. Small parcels, different buyers, but they all trace back to companies he controls. The pieces were starting to form a larger picture. He's planning a land grab. More than that, he's planning to force me into bankruptcy." Howard's voice carried decades of controlled anger. "Brett's got inside information about oil leases that are coming up for renewal. He's been positioning himself to undercut my bids, buy out my neighboring properties, and basically box me into a corner where I'll have to sell to him at a fraction of what this land is worth. And Darla, my daughter, is a romantic fool. She thinks Brett loves her, that they're going to run away together and start fresh. What she doesn't know is that Brett's been feeding her information to use against me. Every time she comes to visit, she asks questions about my business, my finances, my plans. I thought she was just taking an interest in the family operation." Howard drained his bourbon and set the glass down with controlled force. "Brett Wolfe is using my daughter to destroy everything I've built. And when he's done with that, he'll discard her like yesterday's newspaper." Jack studied the older man carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only one who can stop him. I've seen your military records, Jack. I know who you really are, what you really did over there. Darla might have married you thinking she was getting a simple security consultant, but I know better." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Howard Carpenter had done his own research. "I also know," Howard continued, "that you've been conducting surveillance on your wife and her lover. I know you've got evidence of the affair. And I know you're not the type of man who takes betrayal lying down." Jack remained silent, but his mind was racing. Howard's revelation added new dimensions to his own plans for revenge. This wasn't just about a cheating wife anymore. It was about a complex web of deception that threatened everything Jack valued. "What are you proposing?" Jack asked finally. "A partnership. You want revenge on the people who betrayed you. I want to protect what's mine and see Brett Wolfe destroyed. We can help each other. And Darla..." Howard's expression hardened. "My daughter made her choice. She chose to betray her husband and conspire against her own family. She'll face the consequences of that choice." Jack considered the offer. Howard Carpenter was offering resources, local knowledge, and what amounted to permission to pursue his own agenda against Darla and Brett. But accepting the offer would mean trusting a man he barely knew, and Jack Hudson trusted very few people. "I need details," Jack said. "Everything you know about Brett's plans, his associates, his timeline. Everything you know about Darla's involvement." Howard smiled for the first time that evening. "I was hoping you'd say that." Over the next 2 hours, Howard laid out a comprehensive picture of Brett Wolfe's scheme. The man wasn't just a successful real estate developer. He was a sophisticated predator who'd used similar tactics to acquire properties across 3 states. He identified families with valuable holdings, found their weak points, and exploited them through a combination of financial pressure and personal manipulation. In the Carpenter family's case, Darla had been the perfect target. married to a man she'd grown bored with. Feeling neglected and unappreciated, she'd been vulnerable to Brett's particular brand of charm, and her access to family information had made her invaluable. The irony, Howard said, refilling their glasses, is that Darla thinks she's rebelling against me by having this affair. She has no idea she's helping Brett destroy everything she'll inherit someday. When does he make his move? Jack asked. Soon. The oil lease renewals are next month. If Brett's going to force me into a corner, he'll need to have all his pieces in place by then. Jack nodded slowly. A plan was beginning to form in his mind. Something far more sophisticated and brutal than simple revenge against a cheating spouse. If Brett Wolfe wanted to play games with other people's lives, Jack would show him what a real player looked like. I'm in, Jack said finally. But we do this my way, and when it's over, everyone who betrayed us pays the full price. Howard raised his glass. To justice, then. To retribution, Jack corrected. As they drank, Jack was already thinking ahead to the next phase of his plan. Brett Wolfe had made a critical error in judgment. He'd seen Jack as an obstacle to be removed, a simple suburban husband who could be outmaneuvered through legal tricks and social pressure. What Brett didn't understand was that Jack Hudson had spent years in places where the consequences of underestimating your enemy were measured in body bags. He learned to think not just strategically, but ruthlessly. And he learned that the most effective revenge wasn't just about winning. It was about ensuring your enemies never had the chance to threaten you again. By the time Jack drove home that night, his original plan had evolved into something far more comprehensive. Brett Wolfe wanted to destroy the Carpenter family fortune and steal Jack's wife and daughter. Jack would let him think he was succeeding, right up until the moment he destroyed Brett's life completely. Chapter 3. The Setup. 2 weeks after his meeting with Howard, Jack sat in his study reviewing the final details of what he'd begun thinking of as Operation Firefly, named after the insect Emma had caught and released, a reminder of his daughter's innocent wisdom about letting beautiful things go free. The surveillance had revealed more than Jack had initially expected. Brett Wolfe's scheme involved not just land acquisition, but a complex network of shell companies, bribed officials, and intimidation tactics. More importantly, Jack had discovered that Brett had done this before, leaving a trail of broken families and stolen fortunes across the Southwest. But Brett had never encountered someone like Jack Hudson. The plan Jack had developed was elegantly simple in concept, brutally complex in execution. Rather than expose Brett's crimes or fight him in court, Jack would let Brett's own greed and arrogance destroy him. The key was giving Brett exactly what he thought he wanted, while ensuring that getting it would cost him everything. Phase 1 had already begun. Using his security consulting contacts, Jack had fed carefully crafted misinformation into the intelligence networks that Brett relied on. False reports about Howard's financial situation, fabricated documents suggesting the old man was more vulnerable than he actually was, and misleading information about upcoming oil lease opportunities. Brett had taken the bait eagerly, accelerating his timeline and committing more resources to what he believed would be his biggest score yet. Phase 2 involved Darla directly. Through the intercepted communications, Jack knew that Brett was pressuring Darla to convince her father to make certain financial decisions that would actually benefit Brett's acquisition plans. What Darla didn't know was that her father was aware of her attempts at manipulation and was feeding her information designed to mislead Brett. But Phase 3 was where Jack's true skills would come into play. And for that, he needed everything to happen at Howard's ranch on ground of their choosing. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Darla announced at dinner that she wanted to take Emma to visit Grandpa Howard for an extended weekend, Friday through Monday. Brett, she explained, had business meetings in Dallas and wouldn't be around anyway. That sounds like a great idea, Jack said, maintaining the same supportive tone he'd used throughout their marriage. Emma loved spending time at the ranch. What Darla didn't know was that Jack had arranged Brett's business meetings through a shell company, creating a false real estate opportunity that would require Brett's immediate attention. The beauty of the setup was that Brett would think he was choosing to be away, maintaining his usual pattern of prioritizing business over his relationship with Darla. Actually, Jack continued, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision. I might drive up Saturday afternoon. I've been thinking about asking your father's advice on some land investments. Darla's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Land investments? Some of my consulting clients have been talking about ranch properties as investment opportunities. Howard knows that market better than anyone. It was a lie wrapped in enough truth to be believable. Darla accepted it with the kind of relief that confirmed she'd been planning to use the weekend for her own purposes. Jack waited until Thursday night to make his next move. Darla was already asleep when he slipped out to his workshop and placed a call to Earl Russell, the county sheriff for the area around Howard's ranch. Earl was a practical man who'd served as sheriff for 15 years. He'd worked with Jack on a few cases where Jack's security consulting had intersected with local law enforcement, and he developed a healthy respect for Jack's abilities. Jack. Earl's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd seen too much over the years. What can I do for you? I need to report a potential kidnapping situation, Jack said. It might happen this weekend at the Carpenter Ranch. The conversation that followed was carefully choreographed. Jack explained that he'd received intelligence suggesting that someone might attempt to harm his daughter during the weekend visit. He provided enough detail to sound credible without revealing his sources or methods. Most importantly, he established the legal framework for what would happen next. You want me to put extra patrols in the area? Earl asked. No, too obvious. But I want you to be ready to respond quickly if something goes wrong. And Earl, if my daughter is threatened, I'm going to protect her by any means necessary. Earl understood the subtext. You do what you have to do, Jack. I'll make sure the paperwork reflects the right sequence of events. Friday morning, Jack watched Darla pack Emma's things with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was planning more than a simple family visit. Emma was excited about seeing her grandfather and spending time exploring the ranch, chattering about the horses and the old barn and the creek that ran through the property. Be good for your mother and grandpa, Jack told Emma as he hugged her goodbye. And remember what I taught you about staying safe. It was their code. Jack had trained Emma in basic safety protocols, not because he was paranoid, but because his work had taught him that preparation was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Emma knew how to find hiding places, how to stay quiet when told, and most importantly, how to signal for help if needed. I will, Daddy, Emma whispered into his ear. I love you. I love you too, sweetheart, more than all the stars in the sky. After they left, Jack spent Friday completing his final preparations. He loaded his truck with equipment that officially didn't exist, military-grade surveillance gear, communication devices, and other tools from his consulting work that operated in legal gray areas. He also packed items that were decidedly illegal but necessary for what he planned to do. Saturday morning, Jack received the text he'd been expecting from Brett. Meeting delayed until Monday. Darla says you're coming up to see Howard. Might be a good opportunity to discuss some business. Perfect. Brett was taking the bait, just as Jack had predicted. The man's arrogance wouldn't let him resist the opportunity to manipulate Jack in person. Jack's response was carefully neutral, always interested in good business opportunities. See you there. As Jack drove toward the Carpenter Ranch that afternoon, he reflected on how much had changed since he'd discovered Darla's affair. The initial anger had evolved into something colder and more focused. This wasn't about wounded pride or jealousy anymore. It was about protecting what mattered and destroying those who threatened it. The ranch came into view as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Howard's property sprawled across several thousand acres of Texas countryside, with the main house situated on a rise that provided commanding views in all directions. It was beautiful country, the kind of place that had been in families for generations and was worth fighting to protect. Jack could see Emma playing near the old barn, her laughter carrying across the distance. Darla sat on the porch with Howard, apparently engaged in serious conversation. And parked behind the house, barely visible from the main approach, was Brett Wolf's BMW. So Brett had arrived early, abandoning his Dallas business meetings to pursue what he thought was a more lucrative opportunity. The man's predictability would be his downfall. Jack parked his truck and walked toward the house, maintaining the relaxed demeanor of a son-in-law visiting family. But his eyes were cataloging details, The position of vehicles, the location of buildings, the terrain features that would matter in the hours to come. "Jack," Howard called out from the porch. "Good to see you made it safely." As Jack climbed the porch steps, he noticed the tension in Darla's posture. Her smile was forced, and she kept glancing toward the house as if expecting something or someone to emerge. "Where's Emma?" Jack asked. "Playing in the barn," Darla said quickly. "She's fine. Dad's been keeping an eye on her." "Actually," Brett Wolf's voice came from the doorway behind them. "I've been entertaining her with stories about real estate development." Fascinating conversation. Brett emerged onto the porch with the kind of confident swagger that had probably served him well in business negotiations. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, well-dressed and articulate, with the kind of charm that could convince people to make decisions against their better judgment. "Brett," Jack extended his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Darla mentioned you might be here. Something about business opportunities?" "Always looking for the next deal," Brett replied, his handshake firm and aggressive. "Your father-in-law has some interesting properties that could be developed." The conversation that followed was a carefully orchestrated dance. Brett positioned himself as the helpful expert, explaining various development opportunities while subtly probing for information about Jack's financial situation and investment interests. Darla played her role as the supportive wife, occasionally adding comments that were clearly designed to reinforce Brett's points. Howard mostly listened, occasionally asking questions that revealed far more about Brett's plans than Brett realized. The old man was a master at appearing simple while extracting complex information. As the afternoon wore on, Jack noticed Brett becoming more aggressive in his sales pitch. The man was clearly working towards some kind of proposal, something he planned to spring on Jack during this visit. The moment came as they sat down for dinner. Emma had been fed earlier and was playing in the living room, within sight but out of earshot. "Jack," Brett said, cutting into his steak with theatrical precision, "I've been thinking about your situation. Successful business, beautiful family, but probably not the kind of liquid assets that would let you take advantage of really significant opportunities." "What kind of opportunities?" Jack asked, though he already knew where this was heading. "Well, Howard's been considering selling some of his marginal properties. With the right partner, someone could acquire significant acreage at below-market prices. But it would require moving quickly, and it would require substantial cash investment." The proposal that followed was elegantly crafted. Brett offered to bring Jack into a partnership that would involve purchasing several of Howard's properties at what appeared to be generous prices. Jack would provide the capital, Brett would handle the development and marketing, and they'd split the profits. What Brett didn't explain was that the properties he wanted to buy were the key parcels in his larger scheme. By acquiring them through Jack, Brett would complete his encirclement of Howard's core holdings while appearing to help rather than threaten the family. "It sounds interesting," Jack said finally, "but I want to walk the properties before making any decisions. See exactly what we're talking about." "Of course," Brett smiled. "We could do that tomorrow morning. Some of the best parcels are in the back sections of the ranch, near the old wells." Howard's expression didn't change, but Jack caught the slight tightening around his eyes. They discussed this moment during their planning sessions. The old wells were in the most remote section of the property, accessible only by ranch roads and surrounded by terrain that would provide perfect concealment for what Jack had planned. "That sounds perfect," Jack agreed. "Should we include Darla and Emma in the tour?" Actually, Darla spoke up quickly. "Emma and I were planning to visit some of Dad's old family sites tomorrow. Places she's never seen." Another lie, smoothly delivered. Jack wondered if Darla had always been this deceptive, or if Brett had taught her these skills. "Well then," Jack said, raising his glass in a toast, "to new partnerships and family traditions." As they drank, Jack caught Howard's eye across the table. The old man nodded almost imperceptibly. Everything was proceeding according to plan. After dinner, as Brett and Darla engaged in what they thought was private conversation on the porch, Jack slipped away to check on Emma. He found his daughter in the living room, playing with a set of toy horses that had belonged to her mother as a child. "Having fun, sweetheart?" Jack asked, sitting beside her on the floor. "Uh-huh. But Daddy, that man Brett asks a lot of questions." "What kind of questions?" "About you." about where you work and what you do, and about Mommy. He wanted to know if Mommy was happy. Jack felt a cold anger settle in his chest. Brett had been interrogating his 8-year-old daughter, probably looking for information he could use in custody proceedings. What did you tell him? Jack asked gently. I told him Mommy smiles more when you're not home, Emma said with the brutal honesty of childhood. But I like it better when you're home because you read better stories. Jack hugged his daughter closer, inhaling the scent of her shampoo and memorizing the feel of her small body against his chest. In less than 24 hours, everything would change. But Emma would be safe. He makes sure of that. Emma, remember what we talked about? About the special games we play, the hiding games? That's right. Tomorrow, we might play one of those games. If Mommy or Grandpa Howard tell you to do something special, you do exactly what they say, okay? Even if it seems scary. Emma looked up at him with solemn eyes. Is something bad going to happen? Something's going to happen, Jack said carefully. But I promise you, you're going to be safe. Daddy will make sure of that. Later that night, as the house settled into quiet, Jack made his final preparations. He slipped out to his truck and retrieved the equipment he'd need for tomorrow, concealing it in predetermined locations around the ranch property. Howard had provided detailed maps and access to buildings that would serve as staging areas. Most importantly, the old man had ensured that the ranch's security cameras would malfunction at precisely the right moments, leaving no electronic record of what was about to happen. As Jack returned to the house, he paused on the porch where he'd toasted new partnerships just hours earlier. Through the window, he could see Darla sleeping in the guest room, her phone clutched in her hand, even in sleep. In a few hours, she would wake up believing she was one step closer to her new life with Brett Wolfe. She had no idea that she was about to participate in the destruction of everything she thought she wanted. Jack Hudson had spent years learning that the most effective operations were those where the targets destroyed themselves. Tomorrow, he would give Darla and Brett exactly what they deserved and exactly what they'd asked for. The well was waiting. Chapter 4. The Deception. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp air that made the Texas sky seem impossibly wide. Jack woke before sunrise, slipping out of the guest room where he'd slept on the couch to avoid sharing a bed with Darla. He found Howard already in the kitchen, coffee brewing and the morning news playing quietly on a small television. Sleep well? Howard asked, though both men knew sleep had been the last thing on either of their minds. Well enough. Jack poured himself coffee and moved to the window overlooking the property. Everything ready. Emma's equipment is in place. Earl Russell's got his people positioned, but out of sight. And our friend Brett woke up about an hour ago, already making phone calls to his partners about the big score he's about to make. Through the intercepted communications, they knew Brett had been boasting to his associates about the Carpenter acquisition. He'd already begun transferring funds for what he believed would be his final payment to secure the key properties. More importantly, he'd started making arrangements to relocate Darla and Emma after Jack was dealt with through legal channels. Darla, Jack asked, still sleeping, but she got 3 text messages from Brett between midnight and 6 a.m. Seems like he's eager to move to the next phase of their plan. Jack nodded, checking his watch. 8:15 a.m. According to their choreographed timeline, Brett would suggest the property tour around 9:30, giving Jack just enough time to complete his final preparations. I need to talk to Emma first, Jack said. He found his daughter in her temporary bedroom, already dressed and brushing her teeth in the adjoining bathroom. She looked small in the oversized guest room, but her eyes were bright and alert. Morning, Daddy, she said around her toothbrush. Morning, sweetheart. Remember what we talked about yesterday? About the special games? Emma nodded solemnly. The hiding games. That's right. Today, Grandpa Howard might ask you to play one of those games. If he does, you follow his instructions exactly, and you don't come out until either he or I come and get you. Understand? What if Mommy comes to get me? Jack knelt down to Emma's eye level. Not today, sweetheart. Today, it's just Grandpa Howard or Daddy. Nobody else. Emma studied his face with the intensity that children reserved for moments when they sensed adult emotions they couldn't quite understand. Are you and Mommy fighting? Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, Jack said carefully. But no matter what happens, I love you more than anything in the world. And I will always, always protect you. I know, Daddy. As Jack hugged his daughter, he made a silent promise that whatever else happened today, Emma would emerge from this intact. The innocence in her eyes was the one thing Brett Wolfe and Darla would never be allowed to touch. Breakfast was a study in forced normalcy. Darla had emerged from her room with carefully applied makeup and a cheerfulness that seemed designed to convince herself as much as anyone else. Brett arrived promptly at 9 a.m., bringing fresh coffee and pastries from town, the kind of thoughtful gesture that probably reinforced Darla's belief that he genuinely cared about her. "Beautiful morning for a property tour," Brett announced, settling into a chair at the kitchen table with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was about to close the deal of a lifetime. "Perfect weather," Jack agreed. "I'm looking forward to seeing these parcels you mentioned." The conversation over breakfast was carefully orchestrated, with each participant playing their assigned role. Brett positioned himself as the knowledgeable guide, explaining the various factors that made Howard's back properties so valuable for development. Darla played the supportive wife, asking questions that allowed Brett to elaborate on his expertise. Howard maintained his role as the practical rancher, raising just enough concerns to seem realistic without derailing Brett's enthusiasm. Only Jack knew that every word was being recorded by equipment he'd concealed around the house the night before. The breakfast conversation would serve as crucial evidence for what was to come. "Well," Brett said, checking his expensive watch, "if we're going to see those properties before it gets too hot, we should probably head out soon." "Absolutely." Jack stood and stretched. "Darla, you and Emma have plans for this morning?" "Oh, yes," Darla replied quickly. "Dad promised to show Emma some of the old family sites. Places where her great-grandmother used to live, that sort of thing." Another lie, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that confirmed Darla had been planning this deception for weeks. What she didn't know was that Howard had never made any such promise, and the family sites she referenced didn't exist. "That sounds educational," Jack said. "Emma loves learning about family history." As the men prepared to leave for their property tour, Jack caught Howard's eye one final time. The old man nodded slightly. Everything was in place. "Take care of my girls," Jack told Howard, knowing that Darla would interpret the comment as typical husband-father concern. "Always do," Howard replied. Brett's BMW was loaded with surveying equipment, maps, and a cooler full of drinks, props for what he believed would be a productive business meeting in the remote sections of the ranch. As they drove away from the main house, Brett began his sales pitch in earnest. "The beauty of these back properties," Brett explained as they bounced along increasingly rough ranch roads, "is that they're close enough to town for development, but far enough out to avoid most zoning restrictions. With the right approach, we could be looking at a 20-fold return on investment within 5 years." Jack nodded and asked appropriate questions, playing the role of the interested investor while mentally cataloging every detail of their route. The old wells were located in a section of the property that hadn't been actively used for ranching in decades. The access road was barely maintained, winding through scrub brush and rocky terrain that would make outside observation nearly impossible. "There," Brett pointed ahead as they crested a small rise. "That's the main parcel I was telling you about." The landscape before them was typical Texas ranch country, rolling hills covered in sparse vegetation, with clusters of weathered buildings marking old homestead sites. But Jack's attention was focused on the structures Brett was indicating. A collection of abandoned buildings surrounding what appeared to be an old wellhead. "This is where the original Carpenter homestead was located," Brett continued, parking the BMW near a cluster of buildings that included a barn, a small house, and several outbuildings. "Howard's grandfather built the first well here in the 1920s. It's been sealed for decades, but the location has excellent access to the water table." Jack climbed out of the car and surveyed the area with professional interest. The isolation was perfect. They were at least 5 miles from the main house, with no line of sight to any neighboring properties. The abandoned buildings would provide excellent concealment for what he'd planned. "Interesting location," Jack said. "Tell me about the water rights." For the next hour, Brett led Jack through an elaborate presentation about development opportunities, water access, mineral rights, and zoning possibilities. The man was genuinely knowledgeable about real estate development, which made his criminal activities all the more calculated. As Brett talked, Jack noticed several details that confirmed his intelligence about Brett's operation. Survey markers that shouldn't have been there. Recent tire tracks from multiple vehicles. Evidence that someone had been conducting unauthorized surveys of Howard's property. "You've done your homework," Jack observed. "Always do," Brett replied with obvious pride. "I never go into a deal without knowing every angle." "What about the legal angles? Making sure all the transfers are properly documented, that sort of thing?" Brett's expression shifted slightly. "Well, that's where having the right relationships becomes important. I work with people who understand how to expedite certain processes." It was as close to an admission of corruption as Jack was likely to get. Brett was essentially confessing to bribing officials and falsifying documents, though he was careful not to use those specific terms. "I appreciate thoroughness," Jack said. "It's important to know exactly who you're dealing with." "Absolutely. Speaking of which, Jack, I should probably mention that I've done some research on your background too. Impressive military record. Your consulting business seems to be doing well, but I get the sense that you might be ready for something bigger, something with more potential for real wealth." Jack felt a cold smile touch his lips. Brett was beginning his recruitment pitch, probably the same approach he'd used with Darla. Appeal to their ambitions, make them believe they deserve more, then gradually involve them in increasingly questionable activities. "I'm always interested in opportunities," Jack said. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, to be honest, this carpenter deal is just the beginning. I've got projects lined up across 3 states. Military logistics, government consulting, private security contracts. The kind of work that could really benefit from someone with your background and security clearance." Brett was offering Jack a partnership in what amounted to a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The man's arrogance was breathtaking. He was literally trying to recruit Jack into the conspiracy against Jack's own family. "That sounds intriguing," Jack said carefully, "but I want to understand the full scope of what you're proposing." "Of course. That's why I think this property tour is so valuable. It gives us a chance to talk privately away from complications." "Complications?" Brett's expression became more calculating. "Well, to be completely honest, Jack, I think you and I both know that your marriage isn't exactly what it appears to be. Darla's a remarkable woman, but she's not happy. She needs someone who understands her potential, who can give her the kind of life she deserves." The audacity was stunning. Brett was standing in the middle of Howard Carpenter's property, preparing to steal the man's land and seduce his daughter, while trying to convince Jack to join the conspiracy against his own family. "What are you suggesting?" Jack asked. "I'm suggesting that sometimes the best business partnerships involve personal changes too. Darla could be much happier with someone who really appreciates her. Emma could benefit from having a father figure who can provide real opportunities. And you could be free to pursue the kind of career that matches your abilities." Brett was proposing exactly what Jack had expected, a complete restructuring of Jack's life that would leave Brett in control of everything Jack valued. The man probably thought he was being subtle. "That's a bold proposal," Jack said. "Life is short," Brett replied. "Sometimes you have to take bold action to get what you want." Jack checked his watch. 11:45 a.m. According to their timeline, Howard would be initiating Phase 2 right about now. "You know what, Brett? You're absolutely right about taking bold action. I'm glad you see it that way." "I do. In fact, I think it's time we headed back to the house. I'm ready to move forward with this partnership." Brett's smile was triumphant. "Excellent. I think you're going to be very happy with this decision." As they drove back toward the main house, Brett continued his sales pitch, apparently convinced that he'd successfully recruited Jack into his conspiracy. The man's confidence was so complete that he began sharing details about his other operations, his network of corrupt officials, and his plans for expanding into new markets. Jack memorized every word, knowing that Brett was essentially dictating his own confession. They were about halfway back to the main house when Jack's phone rang. Howard's name appeared on the display. "Howard, Jack answered, making sure Brett could hear both sides of the conversation. Jack, thank God. You need to get back here immediately. What's wrong? It's Emma. Darla and we were showing her the old family sites, and there was an accident. She fell into one of the old wells. Jack felt his blood freeze, even though he knew this was part of their plan. The emotion in Howard's voice sounded completely genuine. She's alive, but she's trapped. The well is deep, and the sides are unstable. We got to seal it to prevent a cave-in, but what? Jack, if we seal it with her inside. Jack closed his eyes, letting the horror of the situation wash over him. Beside him, Brett had gone pale, apparently shocked by what he was hearing. We're on our way, Jack said. Don't do anything until I get there. Hurry, Jack. We don't have much time. Jack ended the call and looked at Brett. We need to get back to the house. Now. Jesus, Jack, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do? Just drive. As Brett accelerated along the ranch roads, Jack allowed himself to show the anguish that any father would feel in this situation. The performance wasn't difficult. Even though he knew Emma was safe, the scenario Howard had described was every parent's nightmare. What Brett didn't know was that phase 2 of their plan was now complete. Howard had just established the timeline and circumstances that would justify everything that was about to happen next. And Jack Hudson was about to show Brett Wolfe exactly what bold action really meant. Chapter 5, The Trap Springs. When Brett's BMW skidded to a stop in front of the main house, Jack was out of the car before the engine died. The scene that greeted him was a masterpiece of controlled chaos, exactly what Howard had promised to create. Darla stood on the front porch, tears streaming down her face, her clothes dirty as if she'd been digging or crawling. She rushed toward Jack the moment she saw him, and for a moment, her distress seemed completely genuine. Jack, oh God, Jack, it happened so fast, she sobbed into his chest. We were just exploring the old homestead sites, and Emma wanted to look at the well, and the covering gave way, and she fell in. Where is she? Jack's voice carried exactly the right combination of panic and determination. Howard appeared from around the side of the house, his face grim and his hands dirty. In the distance, Jack could hear the sound of heavy equipment, a backhoe that Howard had strategically positioned near the supposed accident site. She's about 15 feet down, Howard said, conscious and talking, but scared. The well's old, and the sides are starting to crumble. Every minute we wait increases the chance of a complete collapse. Brett Wolfe stood frozen beside his car, apparently stunned by the catastrophe unfolding around him. Is there anything I can do? Should I call 911? Already did, Howard said grimly. But they're 20 minutes out, and we don't have 20 minutes. The whole structure is unstable. Jack looked around the scene, his trained eye cataloging details that would matter later. Howard's performance was flawless. Every element supported the narrative they'd constructed. The backhoe was positioned as if it had been brought in to attempt a rescue. Darla's distress appeared completely authentic. Even the timing was perfect. I need to see her, Jack said. It's dangerous, Howard warned. The ground around the well mouth is unstable. Too much weight, and the whole thing could collapse. I don't care. She's my daughter. Howard nodded grimly. I understand. But Jack, if we're going to seal the well to prevent a cave-in, we need to do it soon. And if we do that, the implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Jack felt his legs weaken, and he had to grab the porch railing for support. The performance wasn't difficult. Any father facing this scenario would be overwhelmed. There has to be another way, Jack said. Maybe, Howard said carefully, but it would require some difficult decisions. Brett stepped forward, his businessman's instincts apparently overriding his shock. What kind of decisions? Howard looked at Brett, as if noticing him for the first time. This is family business, son. I'm not sure it concerns you. Brett was with me when you called. Jack explained. He drove me back. I see. Howard's expression suggested he saw far more than he was saying. Well, the situation is this. We could try to excavate around the well, create a secondary access point. But that would require heavy equipment, specialized knowledge, and probably 12 to 18 hours of work. 12 hours. Darla's voice cracked. She can't survive down there for 12 hours. There's another option, Howard continued reluctantly. But it would require trust, and it would require everyone involved to keep certain details private. Jack felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment Howard had been building toward. What option? Brett asked. Howard studied Brett carefully, as if evaluating whether to trust him with sensitive information. There are some military-grade rescue techniques that could work, techniques that Jack learned during his service. But they involve equipment and methods that aren't exactly available through normal channels. Brett's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of equipment? The kind that doesn't officially exist, Jack said quietly. The kind that requires certain people to look the other way and certain events to be described in ways that protect everyone involved. I don't understand, Darla said, though her expression suggested she was beginning to. What Howard is saying, Jack explained, is that I have access to resources that could save Emma. But using those resources would involve certain legal complications. People would need to agree on what happened here and what didn't happen. Brett's lawyer instincts were clearly engaged. What kind of legal complications? The kind that require mutual trust and mutual benefit, Howard said meaningfully. The kind that create partnerships between people who understand the value of discretion. Jack watched Brett's face as the man processed what was being offered. Brett was being invited into a conspiracy, one that would make him complicit in covering up Jack's use of illegal resources to save his daughter. It was exactly the kind of leverage Brett believed he could use later. If Jack can save Emma, Brett said carefully, then I think we all understand the importance of describing events in a way that protects everyone involved, even if that requires certain creative interpretations of what happened. Howard pressed. Of course. Darla looked between the three men, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. But her maternal instincts overrode her confusion. I don't care what we have to do. Save my daughter. Jack felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. Brett had just agreed to participate in a conspiracy to cover up illegal activities. More importantly, he'd done so in front of witnesses and, unknown to him, recording equipment. All right, Jack said, but we need to move fast, and we need to coordinate this carefully. Howard, can you handle the official response? Make sure the emergency crews understand the situation when they arrive. Consider it done. Brett, I need you to help me move some equipment from my truck. And I need your word that what happens here today stays between us. You have it, Brett said immediately. Darla, Jack turned to his wife, allowing his voice to carry both love and desperation. I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Of course, she whispered. Just save her. Over the next hour, Jack orchestrated a performance that would have impressed his old military instructors. Using equipment he'd concealed around the property the night before, he created the appearance of a sophisticated rescue operation. Brett was assigned tasks that kept him busy and visible, establishing his presence at the scene during crucial times. Howard managed the official response, coordinating with sheriff's deputies and emergency personnel in a way that supported their manufacture timeline. Most importantly, he ensured that certain key pieces of evidence were in place when law enforcement arrived. The centerpiece of the operation was the well itself. Howard had prepared it meticulously, creating the appearance of a recent cave-in while ensuring that Emma was never actually in danger. Hidden passages and pre-positioned equipment allowed them to create all the sounds and evidence needed to support their story. As the afternoon wore on, Jack played his role flawlessly. He appeared to descend into the well using specialized equipment, maintain communication with Emma throughout the rescue, and finally emerge with his daughter in his arms as emergency crews arrived on scene. Emma's performance was perfect. Howard had coached her well, and she clung to Jack with exactly the right combination of relief and residual fear. To any observer, she was a child who had just survived a terrifying ordeal. "Daddy," she whispered into his ear as cameras flashed and officials took statements, "was that a good hiding game?" "The best," Jack whispered back. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do." By evening, the immediate crisis was over. Emergency personnel had documented the incident, praised Jack's quick thinking and heroic actions, and departed with statements from all witnesses. The official record would show that Emma Hudson had fallen into an old well, been trapped for several hours, and been successfully rescued by her father using techniques he'd learned during military service. Brett Wolfe had been present throughout the incident and had assisted in the rescue efforts. His statement to authorities corroborated the family's account of events. More importantly, he had willingly participated in what he believed was a cover-up of Jack's use of illegal resources. As the last of the emergency vehicles disappeared down the ranch road, Jack stood on Howard's porch holding Emma and watching Darla fuss over their daughter with what appeared to be genuine maternal concern. "Hell of a day," Brett said, settling into a porch chair with a drink Howard had provided. "But it ended well. That's what matters." "Yes," Jack agreed. "It ended exactly as it should have." Brett raised his glass. "To family, and to partnerships built on trust." Jack clinked his glass against Brett's, maintaining eye contact. "To getting exactly what we deserve." As they drank, Jack reflected on how perfectly the day had unfolded. Brett believed he'd been recruited into Jack's inner circle, had proven his trustworthiness, and had gained leverage over Jack through shared culpability in covering up illegal activities. What Brett didn't know was that he'd actually provided Jack with everything needed to destroy him completely. The man had voluntarily placed himself at the scene of what would officially become a kidnapping, had participated in creating false evidence, and had made statements to law enforcement that were demonstrably false. Most importantly, Brett had revealed the full scope of his corruption, his methods, and his network of accomplices, all while believing he was impressing a potential partner. As the evening settled into comfortable domesticity, Jack began planning the final phase of his operation. Brett Wolfe had played his role perfectly. Soon, it would be time for him to face the consequences of his choices. The well had been sealed, officially and permanently. But Jack Hudson's thirst for retribution was just beginning to be satisfied. Chapter 6: The Unraveling. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with a kind of overcast sky that seemed to press down on the landscape. Jack woke before dawn in the guest room, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch coming to life. In a few hours, everything would change permanently. During the night, while the house slept, Jack had received confirmation that the final pieces of his plan were in place. Earl Russell had positioned his deputies according to their predetermined arrangement. The federal contacts Jack had cultivated during his consulting work were standing by. Most importantly, the comprehensive surveillance network he'd established was ready to capture everything that was about to unfold. Emma was still sleeping, exhausted from her ordeal the day before but physically unharmed. Jack checked on her one final time, memorizing the peaceful expression on her face. By evening, her life would be completely different, but she would be safe and free from the corruption that had infected the adults around her. Howard was already in the kitchen when Jack came downstairs, coffee brewing and morning news playing quietly. The old man looked tired but determined, ready to see their plan through to its conclusion. "Brett's been making phone calls since 5 a.m., Howard reported quietly. "Sounds like he's coordinating with his people about the land transfers. Apparently, he thinks yesterday's events have sealed your partnership." And Darla? Still sleeping, but her phone's been buzzing with text messages. Someone's anxious to talk to her. Jack nodded. Through the intercepted communications, he knew that Brett's associates were pressuring him to finalize the Carpenter land acquisition quickly. Yesterday's incident had convinced them that Jack was now compromised and vulnerable to manipulation. They had no idea how right they were, just not in the way they expected. At 8 a.m., Brett emerged from his room, dressed for business, and carrying a briefcase full of documents. His demeanor was confident and energetic, the attitude of a man who believed he was about to close the biggest deal of his career. "Morning, Jack," Brett said, helping himself to coffee. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about expanding our partnership. I've got some documents I'd like you to review." "Of course," Jack replied. "Though I have to admit, yesterday's events have me rethinking a lot of things." "Understandable. But I think you'll find these opportunities even more compelling now. Sometimes crisis reveals new possibilities." Darla appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her robe, looking haggard and anxious. Her performance as the concerned mother was beginning to crack, revealing the underlying tension of someone whose plans were not proceeding as expected. "How's Emma this morning?" Brett asked her with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Still sleeping," Darla replied. "The doctor said she might be tired for a few days." Trauma response. It was interesting that Darla was maintaining the fiction even when she didn't need to. Jack wondered if she was beginning to believe her own lies, or if she was simply that committed to her deception. "Well," Brett said, settling at the kitchen table and opening his briefcase, "maybe we can take care of some business while she rests." "Jack, I've prepared contract for the land purchases we discussed, plus some additional opportunities that have come up." For the next hour, Brett walked Jack through an elaborate presentation of documents, maps, and financial projections. The proposed deals were even more complex than Jack had expected. A sophisticated scheme that would transfer control of most of Howard's valuable properties to shell companies controlled by Brett. "As you can see," Brett explained, pointing to various clauses in the contracts, "these agreements are structured to provide maximum tax advantages while ensuring rapid appreciation of asset values. With your investment capital and my development expertise, we could be looking at 8-figure returns within 3 years." Jack studied the documents carefully, noting details that Brett probably thought he wouldn't understand. The contracts were masterpieces of legal deception, appearing to benefit all parties while actually transferring most of the value to Brett's hidden entities. "This is impressive work," Jack said finally. "Very sophisticated." "I don't do anything halfway," Brett replied with obvious pride. "I can see that. These shell company structures, the offshore accounts, the regulatory workarounds. This level of complexity requires serious expertise." Brett's smile faltered slightly. "Well, you know how complex real estate law can be." "Oh, I'm not talking about real estate law," Jack said casually. "I'm talking about the other aspects. The bribery infrastructure, the document falsification protocols, the methods for circumventing federal oversight. This is professional-grade criminal enterprise." The silence that followed was deafening. Brett's face went pale, and Darla looked confused and alarmed. Even Howard, who was expecting this moment, seemed taken aback by Jack's directness. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Brett said carefully. "I'm not implying anything," Jack replied. "I'm stating facts. These contracts involve systematic violation of federal anti-corruption statutes, conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and probably RICO predicates." Brett stood up slowly, his businessman's confidence evaporating. "Jack, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No, a misunderstanding. I understand exactly what you are and what you've been doing. The question is whether you understand what I am." Jack reached into his jacket and withdrew his phone, pressing a button that activated the recording equipment concealed throughout the house. Instantly, Brett's voice filled the kitchen. Hours of secretly recorded conversations detailing his criminal schemes, his plans to destroy the Carpenter family, and his intention to steal Jack's wife and daughter. "You see, Brett, I've been recording everything since the moment I discovered your affair with my wife. Every meeting, every phone call, every scheme you've hatched. I know about your network of corrupt officials. I know about your previous victims in Arizona and New Mexico. I know about the families you've destroyed and the fortunes you've stolen." Brett's face was now completely white. "You're making a serious mistake, Jack. You don't know who you're dealing with." "Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You're a predator who's gotten comfortable operating without consequences. But you made one critical error in judgment." "What's that?" "You assumed I was just another suburban husband you could manipulate and destroy. You never bothered to learn who I really am or what I'm really capable of." Jack stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the ranch property where Emma was still sleeping safely in the main house. When he turned back, his expression had changed completely, the mask of suburban normalcy replaced by something far more dangerous. "My name is Jack Hudson. For 12 years, I worked for Joint Special Operations Command, conducting operations that officially never happened in countries that officially don't exist. I've eliminated terrorist networks, disrupted criminal organizations, and destroyed enemies of the United States using methods that would horrify normal people. Brett took a step backward, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. When I left military service, Jack continued, I established a security consulting business that provides legitimate services to legitimate clients. But I also maintain certain capabilities and certain contacts that prove useful when dealing with threats to my family. Jack, Darla said weakly, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that your lover is a professional criminal who's been using you to steal your father's land and destroy our family. I'm talking about the fact that you've been so blinded by your selfish desires that you've helped him plan to take Emma away from me permanently. Darla's face crumpled. That's not. We weren't what? Weren't planning to frame me as an unfit father? Weren't planning to use trumped-up charges to gain custody of Emma? Weren't planning to disappear with her once Brett had finished stealing Howard's properties? Jack pulled out a stack of documents and dropped them on the table. I have recordings of every conversation, copies of every text message, documentation of every lie you've told. I know about the private investigator Brett hired to dig up dirt on me. I know about the false domestic violence allegations you were planning to file. I know about the Swiss bank accounts where Brett has been hiding his stolen assets. Brett was now backing toward the kitchen door, apparently calculating his chances of escape. You can't prove any of this, can I? Jack smiled coldly. Earl Russell should be arriving any minute now with federal warrants for your arrest. FBI, DEA, and IRS investigators have been building cases against your network for months, using information I provided. Your associates in Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada are being arrested as we speak. As if summoned by Jack's words, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard outside. Through the kitchen window, they could see Sheriff Earl Russell's car leading a convoy of federal law enforcement vehicles up the ranch road. You see, Brett, yesterday's little drama served multiple purposes. It confirmed your criminal conspiracy with my wife. It established your presence at the scene during specific times. And most importantly, it gave me the opportunity to plant federal tracking devices in your car, in your briefcase, while you were helping with Emma's rescue. Brett's face went through several expressions: shock, rage, calculation, and finally, desperate cunning. You think you're smart, but you've made mistakes too. I have evidence of your illegal activities from yesterday. Military equipment, unauthorized operations. What military equipment? Jack asked mildly. What unauthorized operations? According to every witness, including you, Emma fell into a well, and I rescued her using conventional methods. The official record shows heroic father saving his daughter, with assistance from concerned family friend Brett Wolf. But the equipment. What equipment? Did you see any military equipment? Did you witness any illegal activities? Because if you did, you'll need to explain why you didn't report them to the authorities who interviewed you yesterday. Brett's mouth opened and closed silently as he realized the trap. By participating in what he thought was a cover-up, he made himself complicit in activities he couldn't now expose without admitting his own guilt. The sound of car doors slamming outside was followed by heavy footsteps on the porch. Earl Russell's voice called out, "Jack, you folks decent in there?" "Come on in, Earl," Jack called back. "We're all here." Sheriff Russell entered the kitchen followed by 6 federal agents wearing tactical gear and badges identifying them as FBI, DEA, and IRS investigators. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with the kind of professional demeanor that came from years of complex financial investigations, stepped forward. "Mr. Brett Wolf?" she asked, though it was clearly a formality. "Yes," Brett replied weakly. "Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and corruption of public officials." As Agent Martinez read Brett his rights, Jack watched Darla's world collapse around her. His wife stood frozen in her robe, apparently unable to process the speed with which her carefully planned new life was disintegrating. "Jack," she whispered, "I can't explain." "No need," Jack replied. "I understand everything perfectly." Agent Martinez finished with Brett's rights and turned to Darla. "Mrs. Hudson, You're also under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and accessory to multiple felonies. Wait, Darla said, panic finally breaking through her shock. I didn't know about any crimes. Brett told me this was legitimate business. Ma'am, you'll have the opportunity to discuss your level of involvement with investigators. But based on recorded communications and documentary evidence, you were an active participant in criminal conspiracy against your own family. As federal agents led Brett and Darla away in handcuffs, Jack felt a profound sense of completion. The people who had betrayed him and threatened his daughter were finally facing consequences proportional to their crimes. Howard clapped Jack on the shoulder. Hell of a thing, watching justice actually work for once. It's not over yet, Jack replied. Brett's criminal network extends across multiple states. His arrest will trigger investigations that'll take years to complete. And Darla, she'll have to live with the knowledge that her selfish choices destroyed not just our family, but her own freedom. What about Emma? Jack looked out the window, toward the main house where his daughter was still sleeping, protected from the chaos that had consumed the adults around her. Emma gets a new life, free from people who would use her as a weapon or a bargaining chip. Free from the corruption that's been poisoning this family. As the last of the law enforcement vehicles disappeared down the ranch road, Jack began planning the next phase of his life. His marriage was over. His wife was facing federal charges. His daughter's mother would likely spend years in prison. But Emma would be safe. Emma would be loved. And Emma would grow up knowing that some people in the world were willing to fight for what mattered, no matter the cost. Jack Hudson had learned long ago that some enemies could only be defeated through complete and total destruction. Today, he'd applied that lesson to protect the most important person in his world. The well had been sealed. The betrayers had been eliminated. And justice, in its most brutal and unforgiving form, had finally been served. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 6 weeks after Brett Wolfe and Darla Hudson were arrested at Howard Carpenter's ranch, Jack sat in his lawyer's office reviewing the final divorce papers. The legal proceedings had moved with unusual speed, thanks largely to the overwhelming evidence of Darla's criminal conspiracy and adultery. She's agreed to relinquish all parental rights. Jack's attorney, William Gillespie, explained as he slid the documents across the mahogany table. In exchange, the prosecution is recommending a reduced sentence on the conspiracy charges. Jack studied the papers that would legally sever Darla's connection to Emma forever. It was a stark conclusion to 12 years of marriage, but Jack felt only relief. Emma would never again be threatened by a mother who'd been willing to use her as leverage in criminal schemes. What's her current status? Jack asked. Federal holding facility in Houston. Bail was denied after she was classified as a flight risk. Her defense attorney is pushing for a plea agreement, but the prosecution isn't feeling generous. Brett Wolfe has been cooperating fully, which means they have detailed information about her level of involvement. Jack wasn't surprised. Brett had proven himself to be exactly the kind of coward who would sell out his accomplices to save himself. The man who'd swagger and manipulated his way through life was now desperately trying to minimize his own prison sentence by betraying everyone he'd worked with. How much time is she looking at? Realistically, 8 to 12 years if she takes a plea. 15 to 20 if she goes to trial and loses. The evidence against her is substantial. Jack signed the divorce papers with steady hands. 12 years of marriage ended with the stroke of a pen and the weight of criminal betrayal. Emma would be 8 years old when her mother was sentenced, possibly 20 when Darla was released from prison. But Emma would be safe. That was all that mattered. There's one other matter, Gillespie continued. The federal investigation into Brett's network has uncovered something interesting. It seems your wife and her lover weren't the only ones involved in this conspiracy. Jack looked up from the papers. What do you mean? Howard Carpenter's been receiving some unusual visitors at the ranch. Federal agents, specifically. Seems like Brett's operation was larger than anyone initially realized. That afternoon, Jack drove out to Howard's ranch to check on Emma and discuss the latest developments in the federal investigation. His daughter had been staying with her grandfather while Jack dealt with the legal complications of the arrests and divorce proceedings. He found Emma in her favorite spot by the old barn, playing with a set of toy horses while Howard watched from the porch. She'd adjusted to her mother's absence with the resilience of childhood, though Jack knew she would eventually need help processing the complex emotions surrounding Darla's betrayal and imprisonment. "Daddy!" Emma ran to him as he climbed out of his truck. "Grandpa, Howard's been teaching me about taking care of horses." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Jack hugged his daughter, feeling the familiar surge of protective love that had driven all his recent actions. "Are you having a good time here?" "Uh-huh. But I miss you. I miss you too. That's why I came to talk to Grandpa about something important." Howard joined them as they walked toward the house. The old man looked tired but satisfied, like someone who'd finally seen justice served after years of frustration. "Federal boys been by again today," Howard said quietly. "Seems like Brett's been talking a blue streak about his operation. Some interesting details coming to light." Inside the house, Howard poured coffee while Emma played in the living room, within sight but out of earshot. Jack could see that his daughter was content and secure. Howard had been good for her during this difficult transition. "What kind of details?" Jack asked. "Turns out Brett's land acquisition scheme was bigger than we thought. He wasn't just targeting my properties. He was part of a network that's been systematically stealing ranch land across the Southwest. Mineral rights, water rights, oil leases, millions of dollars in assets." Jack wasn't entirely surprised. His surveillance of Brett had suggested the man's operation was sophisticated and far-reaching. But the scope was larger than he'd initially understood. How many families were involved? Dozens, maybe hundreds. Brett and his associates would identify properties with valuable resources, then use various methods to force owners into desperate financial situations. Sometimes it was legal manipulation, sometimes intimidation, sometimes outright fraud. And law enforcement never caught on? Howard's expression darkened. "That's where it gets interesting." Turns out Brett had sources inside various agencies. Sheriff's departments, county assessors' offices, state regulatory agencies. He was getting advance information about mineral surveys, environmental assessments, zoning changes, intelligence that let him target specific properties months or years before owners knew their land was valuable. Jack felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Corrupt officials. More than that. According to what the federal boys are telling me, Brett's network included judges, prosecutors, and regulatory officials across 3 states. When legal manipulation didn't work, they'd simply buy the decisions they needed. The implications were staggering. Brett Wolfe hadn't just been a criminal. He'd been part of a systematic conspiracy that corrupted the legal system itself. Families who tried to fight back through proper channels had found themselves facing judges who'd already been bought, prosecutors who wouldn't file charges, and regulatory agencies that rubber-stamped whatever Brett wanted. "What does that leave us?" Jack asked. "Clean. The federal investigation confirms that Brett targeted my family specifically because he thought we were vulnerable. He never expected to run into someone with your background." Jack nodded. His military experience and security consulting contacts had given him resources that Brett's typical victims didn't possess. Most ranch families facing this kind of predatory behavior had no choice but to accept their losses or fight through a legal system that had been systematically corrupted. What about the other families? The ones who lost their properties? "That's the beautiful part," Howard smiled grimly. "Federal prosecutors are using RICO statutes to unwind fraudulent transfers going back 7 years. Families who lost their land are getting it back. Shell companies that bought properties through fraud are being dissolved. And the corrupt officials who enabled Brett's operation are facing their own criminal charges." Jack felt a deep satisfaction at the news. His personal revenge against Brett and Darla had triggered a much larger reckoning that would help dozens of innocent families recover what had been stolen from them. "There's something else," Howard continued. "The federal agents asked me about your role in the investigation. Specifically, they wanted to know if you consider consulting on similar cases." "What kind of consulting?" "Seems like Brett's operation wasn't unique. There are similar networks operating in other regions, using the same methods to steal family properties. The FBI is building a specialized task force to investigate these crimes, and they need people with your skill set." Jack considered the offer. His security consulting business was successful, but it mostly involved protecting wealthy clients from conventional threats. The opportunity to use his abilities to help families fight back against sophisticated predators had a different kind of appeal. What would that involve? Undercover operations, surveillance, financial investigation. Essentially what you did to Brett, but with official sanction and federal resources. You'd be helping families who can't protect themselves against organized criminal networks. It was tempting. Jack had discovered that he was exceptionally good at dismantling complex criminal operations, and the work would provide meaning beyond simple profit. But he also had to consider Emma's needs. "I need to be careful about travel and time commitments," Jack said. "Emma's my priority." "Understood. But Jack, think about what you accomplished here. You saved not just your own family, but dozens of others. That's rare in this world." That evening, as Jack tucked Emma into her temporary bed at Howard's ranch house, his daughter asked the question he'd been dreading. "Daddy, is Mommy ever coming home?" Jack sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. "No, sweetheart. Mommy made some bad choices, and now she has to face the consequences of those choices. Did she stop loving us? I think your mother forgot what love really means. Real love means protecting the people you care about, even when it's hard. It means telling the truth, even when lies seem easier. Your mother forgot those things." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "Do you still love her?" "I'll always care about her, because she's your mother," Jack said carefully. "But I can't trust her anymore. And without trust, love can't survive. Will I see her again? Maybe someday, when you're older. But right now, my job is to keep you safe and help you grow up to be the kind of person who makes good choices." Emma nodded solemnly. "Like you did when you saved me from the well. Like I do every day when I choose to put you first." As Emma drifted off to sleep, Jack reflected on the path that had led them to this point. 6 months ago, he'd been living what most people would consider a normal life: successful career, suburban home, seemingly stable marriage. The discovery of Darla's betrayal had shattered that illusion, but it had also revealed truths about love, loyalty, and justice that were far more valuable. Brett Wolfe was facing life in prison. Darla would spend the best years of her life paying for her crimes. Dozens of corrupt officials were being prosecuted. Innocent families were recovering stolen property. And Emma was safe. Jack Hudson had learned long ago that some battles could only be won through total victory. When enemies threatened what you valued most, half measures and compromise led to defeat. You had to be willing to destroy them completely, no matter the cost. Tonight, as he listened to his daughter's peaceful breathing, Jack knew he'd made the right choice. The people who'd betrayed his family were facing justice. The criminal network that had threatened so many others was being dismantled. Most importantly, Emma would grow up knowing that some people in the world were willing to fight for what mattered, whatever the cost. The well had been sealed. The betrayers had been destroyed. And Jack Hudson had finally found the peace that came from total victory over those who'd threatened his family. Chapter 8: Federal Partnership. 3 months later, Jack stood in a federal office building in Houston, reviewing surveillance footage with Agent Sarah Martinez and her team. The images showed a sophisticated money laundering operation centered around a luxury car dealership in Phoenix. The latest target in what had become Operation Stronghold, the federal task force dedicated to dismantling criminal networks that preyed on family-owned properties. The pattern's identical to Brett Wolfe's operation, Agent Martinez explained, pointing to financial records displayed on multiple monitors. Shell companies, corrupt officials, systematic targeting of families with valuable land holdings. But this network is larger and more sophisticated. Jack studied the evidence with professional interest. In the 3 months since joining the federal task force as a special consultant, he'd helped identify and dismantle criminal operations in 4 states. The work combined his military expertise with his business knowledge in ways that proved devastatingly effective against organized crime. Timeline for moving against them? Jack asked. 2 weeks. We need someone to get close to the leadership, confirm their methods, and document their network of corrupt officials. Someone with your background. Deep cover. Extensive. You'd be posing as a potential investor, someone with military connections and access to capital. The kind of person they recruit as a front for their operations. Jack nodded. It was similar to the approach he'd used against Brett, but with federal resources and legal authority backing his actions. The combination of official sanction and his unconventional methods had proven remarkably effective. What about Emma? She'll stay with Howard during the operation. The man's become quite attached to his granddaughter. That was true. Howard Carpenter had embraced his role as Emma's primary caregiver with enthusiasm that surprised everyone. The old rancher who'd seemed so set in his ways had adapted to 8-year-old energy and curiosity with remarkable grace. More importantly, Emma was thriving under Howard's care. The trauma of losing her mother to federal prison had been offset by the stability and genuine affection Howard provided. She was doing well in the local school, had made friends among the ranch families in the area, and showed no signs of the emotional damage Jack had feared. How long would the operation take? 4 to 6 weeks. Long enough to document their full network and gather evidence for RICO prosecutions. Jack considered the assignment. The Phoenix operation represented everything he'd come to hate about predatory criminals, sophisticated, well-connected, and ruthless in their exploitation of innocent families. Taking them down would help dozens of victims and prevent hundreds more. "I'm in," Jack said, "but I want full tactical support and real-time monitoring. These networks have a tendency to turn violent when cornered. You'll have whatever you need." 2 weeks later, Jack Hudson became Jake Holloway, a former military contractor with connections to private security firms and access to significant capital from undisclosed clients. His cover identity was meticulously crafted, supported by federal resources, and designed to appeal to exactly the kind of criminal network he was targeting. The Phoenix operation was based around Rodriguez Luxury Motors, a high-end car dealership that served as a front for money laundering and asset transfer schemes. The dealership's owner, Ramon Shelton, was a sophisticated criminal who'd spent years building relationships with corrupt officials and wealthy clients who needed certain financial services. Jack's first meeting with Shelton took place in the dealership's VIP showroom, surrounded by exotic cars worth millions of dollars. Shelton was a charming man in his 50s, with the kind of polished confidence that came from years of successful criminal enterprise. "Mr. Holloway," Shelton said, gesturing toward a pristine Ferrari, "I understand you're interested in investment opportunities that provide both profit and discretion." "I represent clients who value privacy," Jack replied, maintaining the careful balance of interest and caution that characterized his cover identity. "Military contractors, security firms, people who operate in gray areas and need financial services that understand their unique requirements. Exactly the kind of clients we serve. Our business model focuses on helping successful people protect and grow their assets without unnecessary government oversight." Over the following weeks, Jack was gradually introduced to the full scope of Shelton's operation. The man's network included corrupt judges, prosecutors, sheriff's deputies, and regulatory officials across Arizona and New Mexico. They perfected a system of identifying valuable properties, manufacturing legal problems for current owners, and acquiring assets at fraction of their true worth. But Shelton's operation was more sophisticated than Brett Wolf's had been. Rather than simply stealing properties, they developed methods for legitimizing their acquisitions through complex legal manipulations that were nearly impossible to challenge through normal channels. "The beauty of our approach," Shelton explained during one of their private meetings, "is that everything appears completely legal. Property owners face legitimate financial pressure, make voluntary decisions to sell, and transfer assets through proper legal channels. By the time they realize they've been manipulated, the transactions are legally unassailable." Jack recorded every conversation, documented every criminal admission, and identified every corrupt official in Shelton's network. The evidence he gathered revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple fraud. This was systematic corruption of the legal system itself. The operation reached its climax when Shelton invited Jack to participate in their next acquisition, a ranch family in New Mexico who were being pressured to sell valuable water rights for a fraction of their worth. Shelton wanted Jack to provide the capital for the purchase, while local officials manufactured legal problems that would force the family into desperation. This is exactly the kind of opportunity that generates substantial returns, Shelton said, reviewing documents in his private office. The family thinks they're selling water rights worth maybe $50,000. They have no idea those rights are worth $20 million to the mining companies we represent. What about the legal challenges? Jack asked. Already arranged. The county assessor will discover tax irregularities that require immediate payment. The environmental agency will find violations that require expensive remediation. The bank will call in loans based on fraudulent asset evaluations. Within 60 days, the family will be facing financial ruin and legal prosecution unless they sell. And if they refuse, Shelton's expression hardened. Let's just say that sometimes accidents happen. Equipment failures, fires, personal tragedies that convince people to reconsider their options. It was a direct admission of extortion and implied threat of violence. Jack had everything he needed to bring down Shelton's entire network. The federal operation moved swiftly. At 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, teams of FBI, DEA, and IRS agents simultaneously raided locations across Arizona and New Mexico. Shelton was arrested at his dealership, surrounded by the luxury cars that had served as symbols of his criminal success. 18 corrupt officials were arrested, including 2 judges, a prosecutor, 3 sheriff's deputies, and various regulatory officials. The network's financial assets were frozen, and their victims were notified that fraudulent property transfers would be reversed. Jack watched the arrest from the Federal Task Force Command Center, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came from seeing justice served against those who preyed on innocent families. "Hell of a job," Agent Martinez said, reviewing the evidence Jack had gathered. "This investigation will generate prosecutions for years, and the civil asset forfeiture will recover millions of dollars for victims." What about the New Mexico family? The one Shelton was targeting? Safe. We intervened before any legal action was taken against them. They'll keep their water rights and receive compensation for the stress they endured. Jack nodded. Another family protected, another criminal network destroyed. It was becoming a pattern he found deeply satisfying. That evening, Jack called Howard's ranch to check on Emma. His daughter's voice was bright and excited as she told him about her day at school, her riding lessons, and a new calf that had been born on the ranch. "When are you coming home, Daddy?" Emma asked. "Soon, sweetheart. Just finishing up some work that helps protect families like ours. Like what you did to that bad man, Brett. Something like that. Making sure people who hurt others face consequences for their actions." "Good. I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, Emma. More than all the stars in the sky." As Jack ended the call, he reflected on how much his life had changed since discovering Darla's betrayal. The personal devastation that had destroyed his marriage had led to a career that provided both purpose and satisfaction. He was using his abilities to protect innocent families from exactly the kind of predators who'd threatened his own. Emma was safe, loved, and growing up with values that would help her make good choices throughout her life. Darla was serving her sentence in federal prison, facing the consequences of her betrayal and criminal conspiracy. Brett Wolfe would likely die in prison, his network of corruption finally exposed and dismantled. And Jack Hudson had found his calling, using the darkest skills from his military past to protect the innocent and destroy those who threatened them. The war against organized crime was far from over. There were other networks, other predators, other families who needed protection. But Jack had learned something important during his personal battle with Brett and Darla. Sometimes the only way to achieve real justice was through total victory. He would continue fighting. For Emma, for the families who couldn't protect themselves, and for the principle that betrayal and corruption should face swift and devastating consequences. The well had been sealed. The betrayers had been destroyed. And Jack Hudson had finally found peace in the knowledge that justice, in its most unforgiving form, would always prevail. Chapter 9. The Final Justice. 1 year after Brett Wolfe's arrest, Jack Hudson stood in the visiting room of the Federal Correctional Institution in Beaumont, Texas, waiting for his final meeting with the man who had tried to destroy his family. The request for this meeting had come from Brett himself, channeled through his attorney and approved by federal authorities. Jack wasn't sure why he'd agreed to come. Brett had nothing left to offer. His cooperation with prosecutors had already provided everything useful for ongoing investigations. His network had been dismantled, his assets seized, his corrupt officials prosecuted. But something about the request suggested Brett had finally begun to understand the magnitude of his miscalculations. Brett entered the visiting room flanked by guards, his expensive suits replaced by standard prison orange. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed demeanor of a man who'd lost everything and faced decades of confinement. At 44, Brett Wolfe looked 20 years older. "Jack," Brett said as he sat across the metal table. "Thank you for coming." Jack studied the broken man before him. "What do you want, Brett?" "I want to understand how you did it. How you played us so completely that we never saw it coming. You want tactical analysis from the man who destroyed you. I want to understand why I lost everything while you gained everything." Jack leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "You lost because you fundamentally misunderstood what you were dealing with. You saw a suburban husband and thought you could manipulate him like your other victims. You never bothered to learn who I really was or what I was really capable of. But it was more than that. You didn't just defend yourself. You orchestrated our complete destruction. Darla, me, our entire network." "How?" "Because you threatened my daughter," Jack said quietly. "The moment you started planning to take Emma away from me, you crossed a line that guaranteed your destruction." Brett's expression showed the first spark of understanding. It was never about Darla. It was never about the affairs or the business schemes. It was only about Emma. Everything was about Emma. Darla was your accomplice. She deserved to face consequences for her betrayal. But you made the mistake of involving my child in your schemes. That made your destruction inevitable. I never meant to hurt Emma. Yes, you did. Your plan required taking her away from me permanently. You were willing to use custody manipulation, false allegations, and legal corruption to steal my daughter and give her to her criminal mother. That wasn't collateral damage. That was deliberate. Brett was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the implications of Jack's words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a hollow understanding. You planned everything from the beginning. The surveillance, the recordings, the fake well incident, the federal investigation, all of it was designed to destroy us completely. The federal investigation was real. Your criminal network was real. The evidence against you was real. I simply provided the authorities with information they needed to protect innocent families. But you could have just exposed the affair. You could have divorced Darla and moved on. Why did you need to destroy our lives so completely? Jack's expression hardened. Because partial victory isn't victory. Because leaving enemies alive gives them the opportunity to return and threaten you again. Because people who are willing to use children as weapons don't deserve mercy or second chances. You destroyed dozens of people. My entire network, all the officials we worked with, everyone connected to our operation. I destroyed criminals who were stealing from innocent families and corrupting the legal system. The collateral damage was people who chose to participate in organized crime. They made their choices. They faced the consequences. Brett shook his head slowly. You're more ruthless than anyone I ever dealt with, including some very dangerous people. I'm a father protecting his daughter. That makes me more dangerous than any criminal you've encountered. The conversation continued for another hour, with Brett asking questions about tactics and Jack providing carefully measured answers. It was like a debriefing between former enemies, with Brett trying to understand how he'd been so completely outmaneuvered. What happens to Emma now? Brett asked finally. Emma grows up safe, loved, and free from people who would use her as leverage or a weapon. She's living with her grandfather on the ranch, doing well in school, and learning that some people in the world are willing to fight for what matters. And you? I continue working with federal authorities to dismantle criminal networks like yours. I use my abilities to protect families who can't protect themselves from organized predators. Brett nodded slowly. You found purpose in destroying us. I found purpose in protecting the innocent and eliminating threats to my family. Your destruction was simply the most effective method for achieving those goals. As the meeting ended and Brett was led back to his cell, Jack reflected on the conversation. The man who'd once been so confident and manipulative was now broken and hopeless, facing 30 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Darla was serving 12 years in a different facility, her parental rights permanently terminated and her future destroyed by her own criminal choices. She would be nearly 50 when released, with no family, no prospects, and a criminal record that would follow her forever. But Emma was thriving. At 9 years old, she was a confident, happy child who loved her life on Howard's ranch. She was academically gifted, socially well-adjusted, and showed no signs of the trauma that might have resulted from her mother's betrayal and abandonment. More importantly, Emma was learning values that would guide her throughout life. She understood the importance of loyalty, honesty, and protecting those you love. She was growing up with the knowledge that some people were willing to fight for what mattered, whatever the cost. That evening, Jack called Howard's ranch to check on Emma before she went to bed. "Daddy," Emma's voice was bright with excitement. "Guess what happened today?" "What, sweetheart?" "We found baby birds in the barn. Howard says we can watch them grow up and learn to fly." "That sounds wonderful. Are you taking good care of them?" "Uh-huh. Howard says we have to be very gentle and let their mama take care of them. But we can watch from far away." "That's exactly right. Sometimes the best way to help someone is to protect them from a distance. Like you do with your work?" Jack smiled. "Something like that. Are you happy, Emma?" "Very happy. I love living on the ranch. I love Howard. And I love you most of all. I love you too, sweetheart. More than all the stars in the sky." After ending the call, Jack drove to his new home, a secure property outside Houston that served as his base of operations for federal task force work. The house was modest but well-equipped, with security systems and communication equipment that allowed him to work effectively with law enforcement agencies across the region. On his desk were files for 3 new investigations: criminal networks in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana that were using methods similar to Brett Wolf's operation. Families were being targeted, properties were being stolen, and corrupt officials were enabling systematic theft of generational wealth. Jack would dismantle these networks just as he destroyed Brett's operation. He would protect the innocent, eliminate the threats, and ensure that criminals who preyed on families faced swift and devastating consequences. The work provided purpose beyond personal satisfaction. Every criminal network destroyed meant dozens of families protected. Every corrupt official prosecuted meant a more honest legal system. Every predator eliminated meant safer communities. But the deepest satisfaction came from knowing that Emma was safe. His daughter would grow up in a world where she was loved, protected, and valued for who she was rather than what she could provide to others. She would never be used as leverage or threatened by people who prioritize their own selfish desires over a child's well-being. Jack Hudson had learned during his military service that some battles could only be won through total victory. When enemies threatened what you valued most, compromise led to defeat. You had to be willing to destroy them completely, whatever the cost. The battle for his family had been won decisively. Brett Wolf was broken and imprisoned. Darla faced years of incarceration for her betrayal. Their criminal network had been dismantled. The corrupt officials who'd enabled their crimes were facing prosecution. Most importantly, Emma was safe, happy, and growing up with people who truly loved her. As Jack reviewed the files for his next operations, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The discovery of Darla's affair had been devastating, but it had also revealed truths about love, loyalty, and justice that were far more valuable than the illusion of domestic tranquility. Real love meant protecting those you cared about, even when it required difficult choices. Real loyalty meant standing by your principles when others abandoned theirs. Real justice meant ensuring that people who hurt the innocent faced consequences proportional to their crimes. The well had been sealed. The betrayers had been destroyed. The innocent had been protected. And Jack Hudson had finally found the peace that came from knowing he'd fought for what mattered most and won. Emma was safe. That was all that had ever mattered. That was all that would ever matter. Justice had been served. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.